Nobody in Colfax County, Nebraska could figure out why 61-year-old Vivian Ashworth spent 2 hours every single morning walking her cattle herd with a digital thermometer and a clipboard, recording a temperature reading for every one of the 140 head on her late brother's ranch, rain or shine, all through that first spring after she took the operation over. Ranchers checked sick animals. Vivian checked all of them, healthy and sick alike, every morning, without exception, entering each number into a spreadsheet she'd built herself on an old laptop in the kitchen. Vivian had spent 34 years as a registered nurse, the last 18 of them in a hospital intensive care unit 2 hours away in Lincoln. Before retiring the same month, her older brother Dell died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her the failing 800-acre cattle operation neither of them had ever expected her to inherit. Most of Colfax County assumed her habit of temping the entire herd daily was simply a nurse's leftover instinct, harmless, maybe a little excessive, but not something that had anything real to do with running a ranch. They were wrong, and it would take a fast-moving respiratory outbreak sweeping through herds across 3 counties before anyone understood exactly how wrong. If stories about quiet dedication, professional instinct, and the surprising ways one career prepares you for another matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Vivian's. Now let's find out what those daily temperature checks were really catching, and why an entire region would eventually be grateful for them. Colfax County sits in the rolling grassland of eastern Nebraska, cattle country built on the kind of steady, unglamorous work that had supported the Ashworth family for 3 generations before Vivian ever considered taking it over herself. Her brother Dell had run the operation alone for the better part of 2 decades, a capable but increasingly overwhelmed rancher managing 800 acres and 140 head of cattle largely by himself after their father passed and their mother moved into town. Vivian had left Colfax County at 18 for nursing school and never seriously planned on returning, building a career that eventually landed her in the intensive care unit at a Lincoln hospital, where she spent nearly 2 decades managing some of the sickest patients in the building, the kind of work that trains a person to notice small changes long before they become emergencies. ICU nursing runs on a particular discipline, tracking vital signs obsessively, not just when a patient looks sick, but continuously, because the whole point of intensive monitoring is catching deterioration in the narrow window before it becomes a crisis, often hours before a patient's outward symptoms would alert anyone paying less careful attention. Dell's sudden death that January left Vivian holding a ranch she had no formal training to run and, if she was honest with herself in those first disorienting weeks, no particular desire to keep. But selling felt like abandoning something her family had built across 3 generations, and Vivian, newly retired and unsure what to do with the sudden empty space in her life, made the decision, mostly out of stubbornness, to try running the operation herself with the help of a part-time hand, a steady young man named Cole Riedenbach who'd worked seasonally for Dell the previous 2 years and knew the herd and the ground considerably better than she did. What Vivian brought to the operation that Cole and the rest of Colfax County didn't immediately recognize as valuable was the exact same disciplined vigilance that had defined her entire nursing career. She didn't know cattle the way a lifelong rancher did, but she knew with absolute clarity that the difference between catching a problem early and catching it late was almost always the difference between a manageable situation and a genuine crisis. In the ICU, that principle applied to sepsis, to cardiac events, to a dozen conditions where minutes and hours mattered enormously. She simply couldn't see any reason it wouldn't apply just as directly to a herd of animals that couldn't tell her in words when something was wrong. She started temping the herd that first March, initially just the animals that looked slightly off to her still inexperienced eye, but she found the practice unsatisfying almost immediately, since it relied entirely on visible symptoms that, in her nursing experience, often showed up well after a problem had already progressed. Within a few weeks, she'd expanded to the entire herd, walking the pasture every morning with a digital thermometer designed for livestock use, recording a baseline temperature for every animal regardless of how it looked, and building, over that first spring, exactly the kind of longitudinal vital sign data she'd spent her whole career reading in hospital charts. Cole found the practice a little baffling at first, though he was too polite and too grateful for steady work to say so directly. "Most folks just check the ones that look sick," he mentioned once, carefully, while helping her move a stubborn heifer through the chute for her morning reading. Vivian told him that by the time an animal looked sick enough for someone to notice without checking, The problem had usually already been building for a day or more, and that, in her experience, the numbers almost always told the story before the symptoms did. Cole didn't argue the point, though he admitted to his own father that evening that the new owner of the Ashworth place had some unusual ideas about running cattle. Word of Vivian's daily routine spread through Colfax County the way most things did. Through the sale barn, the co-op, the diner in town where ranchers gathered most mornings before their own work started. Hollis Bregman, who ran 300 head on the property adjoining the Ashworth Ranch and had known Dell for 30 years, mentioned to another rancher over coffee that the nurse was out there every single morning taking every animal's temperature whether it needed it or not. A comment delivered with the kind of affectionate bewilderment reserved for someone whose background didn't quite fit the work she'd taken on. Most of the county assumed, without much malice, that Vivian was simply overcompensating for her inexperience, applying hospital habits to a job that didn't really need them. Vivian kept at it anyway, building her spreadsheet into something increasingly sophisticated over that first year, tracking not just daily temperatures but rolling averages for each animal, flagging any reading that deviated meaningfully from that individual animal's own established baseline rather than relying on a single generic threshold for the whole herd, a refinement drawn directly from ICU trending protocols where a patient's own baseline mattered as much as any standard reference range. The trouble started in earnest that October, when Colfax County and 2 neighboring counties began seeing an unusually aggressive outbreak of bovine respiratory disease moving through several large operations, a common and normally manageable cattle illness that, in its worst years, could still cause significant losses and spread rapidly through a herd once it took hold, particularly in the stress of fall weaning season when young cattle's immune systems were already taxed by the transition. Vivian noticed something in her data on the morning of October 9th that she almost dismissed. A single yearling steer running a temperature nearly 2 degrees above its own established baseline, not dramatically feverish by any general livestock standard, and showing no visible symptoms whatsoever, no coughing, no lethargy, nothing Cole or any experienced rancher would have flagged on casual observation. But 2 degrees above that specific animal's own consistent baseline was, in Vivian's nursing-trained eye, exactly the kind of early deviation that in a hospital setting would have triggered closer monitoring rather than dismissal. She isolated the steer that same morning, more out of habit than genuine alarm, and continued her full herd temping the following day, watching for the same pattern. 3 more animals showed similarly elevated readings against their own baselines that second morning, still without visible symptoms in any of them. By the 3rd day, 5 more animals had joined the pattern, and Vivian, recognizing something that looked less like isolated variation and more like the earliest edge of a spreading illness, called the regional veterinarian, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, and described what her data showed. Dr. Whitfield, initially somewhat skeptical that temperature deviations this subtle and this early represented anything requiring urgent action, agreed to come out that same afternoon largely out of professional courtesy rather than any real expectation of finding something significant. What he found, once he examined the isolated and flagged animals more closely, was early-stage respiratory infection in every one of them, cases so early that standard visual herd checks, the kind most operations relied on, wouldn't have caught them for another 2 to 4 days, by which point, given how quickly bovine respiratory disease could spread through a stressed fall herd, the infection would likely have moved through a much larger portion of the operation before anyone noticed. Dr. Whitfield began treatment immediately on the flagged animals and, more significantly, used Vivian's data to identify and isolate the earliest cases before the disease had a chance to spread meaningfully through the rest of her 140 head. Meanwhile, the 2 neighboring counties experiencing the same regional outbreak, relying on standard visual monitoring, saw considerably worse outcomes. Hollis Bregman's own operation, immediately adjoining Vivian's, lost nearly 12% of his fall calf crop to the outbreak before his own vet caught the pattern through visible symptoms alone, a loss that, according to his own later estimate, cost him tens of thousands of dollars in that single season. Vivian's herd, by contrast, ended that fall with losses under 2%, a difference Dr. Whitfield described in his own follow-up report to the State Veterinary Extension Office as directly attributable to the earliest documented detection he'd personally encountered in his 16 years of regional practice. Hollis came by that November, walking Vivian's healthy pastures with an expression considerably more serious than the fond bewilderment he'd shown at the diner 2 months earlier. "Cole tells me you catch this stuff before it even shows," he said. Vivian explained, in the same plain, clinical way she'd once explained a patient's chart to a worried family member. that she wasn't catching anything special, only paying attention to numbers the same careful way she always had, and that the numbers, if anyone bothered watching them closely enough, usually told the truth before anything else did. By the following spring, the Regional Veterinary Extension Office had invited Vivian to present her tracking methodology at a county cattle health workshop, and Dr. Whitfield began recommending baseline temperature tracking to several of his other clients, describing Vivian's spreadsheet system, only half joking, as an ICU chart for cattle. Cole, who'd found the whole practice mildly strange that first spring, had by then started keeping his own version of the log for the small herd he ran on his family's separate property. Vivian never made much of what happened that October. When people asked how she'd known something was wrong before any animal looked sick, she usually gave some version of the same answer. She hadn't known anything for certain, not the way Dr. Whitfield's diagnosis eventually confirmed it. She'd simply spent 34 years learning that numbers changed before symptoms did, and she'd never seen a good reason that principle would stop being true just because the patients had 4 legs instead of 2. There is a particular kind of vigilance that transfers more directly between professions than people expect, the discipline of watching closely enough, consistently enough, to catch a problem in the narrow window before it becomes irreversible. Vivian Ashworth hadn't set out to revolutionize how Colfax County monitored cattle health. She'd simply refused to abandon the one professional habit that had defined her entire working life, and in bringing that same quiet, unglamorous vigilance to a ranch nobody expected her to run successfully, she caught something an entire region had been missing until it was almost too late to matter.